All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Conversations on Retail. My name is Matt Pfeiffer. We're so excited to have Jorge Risquez, co-founder and CEO of BOPS, back with us to continue his series on CPFR 2.0. The technology is bringing us closer to consumers. And today, Jorge's guest is Elsy Ocejo, Vice President of Supply Chain for Illess Foods. Just a couple of things in the way of housekeeping before we get started. First of all, thank you to Jorge and his team at BOPS for sponsoring this series. We're so appreciative of all that they're contributing to these conversations. And Jorge's put up quite a body of work with us already. If you've not seen those conversations, you can check them out on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@conversationsonretail. Next, this is intended for those of you that are joining live to be a conversation and not a presentation. So if you've got questions, we would love for you to participate, and you can do that very simply by clicking on the Q&A button in Zoom and submitting your questions and comments in writing. And Jorge will be addressing those as the time is appropriate. Lastly, the opinions and recommendations expressed by Jorge and his guests are their own and not necessarily those of Conversations on Retail. So before acting on those opinions or recommendations, always consider their suitability for your circumstances. So with that, Jorge, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much. Glad you're here.
Thank you, Matt. I'm super excited to be hosting the 4th episode of CPFR 2.0 and more excited to be speaking to you, Elsy, today. So welcome to the show. I have to say to the audience that I'm very excited about the insights you're about to share about the relevance of the VP of supply chain in today's world, particularly around the food and beverage industry. We're going to talk about the internal dynamics of how the VPs of supply chain deal with customers, deal with internal teams like sales, and many others. So those are some of the topics that we're going to be covering today. But I think without further ado to the topics, Elsy, why don't you give us a brief intro? I think you have a very long and deep trajectory in supply chain. Yes, I'd like to pass it to you.
Yes, no, thank you, Jorge, for the invite, and also Matt as well for the introduction. But I'm the VP of supply chain at Illess Foods, as you have said. I lead the procurement, project management, scheduling, and customer experience teams, which is more of the end-to-end supply chain. Illess Foods does custom and proprietary sauces, seasonings, marinades, and syrups. We normally sell to B2B, to big grocery stores, restaurants, etc., normally in the United States, and also with some customers globally. This role is extremely challenging, not because of all the areas that it covers, but because it's also the first one of its kind since the company's inception in 1927. So there's a lot of pressure, of course, to perform in such a small period of time, and also to collaborate and to break down silos inside the company. So that for me was very exciting just to take onto the role. And prior to that, I was the director of supply chain strategy at Bimbo Bakeries USA. And with that role, I was very involved in transformational projects as to really understanding the network of the distribution as well as warehousing, and which technologies needed to be in the warehouse of the future. Some and most of these projects are totally confidential, so I may not explain this further, but probably generally what I could explain will be more as to my experience into that, and probably the difference between a big company and a small company, and how I made the jump from director to VP of supply chain, which is actually very exciting.
Oh, congratulations, Elsy, and thank you very much for your deep introduction. I'm actually excited. I want to ask you a question. So you just mentioned the company that you're working on, Illess Foods, that started in 1927, and now is the first time they have a VP of supply chain. So obviously it's extremely challenging. It's a high growth company. What is the relevance of that role today? And why do you think that role is important for where you're taking the companies? And even if you want to kind of standardize it across the board, why the VP of supply chain is important today?
Wow, that's a That's a very important question right now, as you said. I think most of it is tied to now supply chain officers or VPs of supply chain really need to tie their supply chain strategy with the vision of the company, the business objectives of the company overall. And that is very relevant because now customers are asking, hey, how is your supply chain doing? What is your strategy in order to service us? So now supply chain has a seat at the table with customers. I will tell you that from the role that I had prior at Bimbo to now I'm more exposed to being in meetings with customers, them asking me specific questions as to what is my strategy about transforming the company, how am I restructuring the teams, or how am I supporting with specific items that are critical for their growth as well. So that dynamic is extremely energizing and also very relevant. And if you think about it, also, there has been several supply chain officers that have become CEOs. So it's not only having the technical aspects of supply chain, but also being able to sell a product. And if you are that well-rounded by itself, you are golden as supply chain.
No, you're spot on, and thank you for that. I do agree, and everything really starts with the customer, right? How do you sell a product to the customer, and then what happens all the way down to your operations, your R&D, because really the customer is also feeding what you're building at your R&D. And I think you and I were having a conversation, I think 2 weeks ago, and there was an interesting concept that came up, which is value chain. And it has multiple interpretations, but I really want you, I think you define it very well. Do you mind sharing it with the audience?
Yes, I think there's several people that may get a little bit sensitive as to how value chain has been utilized. What do I mean sensitive? That probably has been not used as is supposed to be, right? But normally when a term comes out, it's normally in everyone's mouth, but what's the purpose of it? I think value chain is defined by any kind of company in its own way. It's like supply chain, right? When I was at Bimbo Bakeries, value chain was basically end-to-end supply chain from when the product was made all the way to delivery to the grocery stores, right? And for several companies, value chain will come into a different terminology. But one of the things I'm actually talking about more is what's the real value in supply chain, right? And I was interviewed by Supply Chain Brain about this specific concept, and which is quite interesting. The reasoning is now that we're on the spotlight, we must understand the value proposition of our company we're working in. And then understanding which teams are the ones that are stronger. For some companies, there may be, sales and marketing team. At Illess Foods, for instance, is the R&D team. And when you start understanding which groups are the strongest, then you need to enable that value proposition of the company through those teams. So that's when you start doing more of a cross-functional, I will say, enabler of growth and tying the strategy with those team strategies in order for the overall company strategy to really work out. So once you understand as a supply chain professional, what is your value proposition inside the company, how you tied it up with your value proposition as a company overall, that's the true value in value chain. You will be enabling the growth. If it's inventory, everything is encompassed there. And then it's not only cost, what everyone sees supply chain as cost. We add value to it. And if you tie that value proposition, that is extremely powerful.
I think is such a good framework because as you're making decisions, right, supply chain really much, again, it ties mostly all the parts, right? You were saying you're able to talk with the customers and customer service. On the other way, you're also dealing with manufacturing. You're also kind of ensuring that you're giving the right signals to R&D as things are happening and executing upon the R&D plans. But that framework of your value chain, in this case, could be R&D. For some other companies, is customer service. It really depends on the capabilities of the companies and where they sit also on kind of the entire supply chain. But that helps you make decisions. And I do want to take that as a starting point because talking about the relevance of the VP of supply chain, you guys are bombarded with trends, digitalization, sustainability, you name them, right? Nearshoring. So I'm assuming having that frameworks help you really make decisions of what is the software or the digital maturity that I want to have in the future to be able to support my R&D practice and customer service or X, Y, and Z. Can you elaborate more into that thought process?
Yes, Jorge, and as you said, you need to juggle a lot of things at the same time as to the trends, because if you're not really on top of a trend, customers will be asking about it, right? Right now, besides digitalization, it's also cybersecurity and sustainability and the nearshoring. So all of those really need to be part of your strategy. On the digitalization and cybersecurity especially, it's very important to really have a database that is clean, that is really reliable, because sometimes throughout time, we will be changing part numbers and then you won't have that specific vision as to how there's a trend, specific item, etc., right? As to the sustainability, well, I don't think that trend is going to go anywhere at all. So we must understand in any standpoint, not only, the freight aspect of it, we need to understand our gas consumption, water consumption. The food waste is going to be something that is still on the works as to how companies are handling it. But that's something that is also very critical and needs to be part of the sustainability strategy. And then, of course, on the freight aspect of it, there's a lot of, I will say, investment to reduce emissions, but there's still a CO2 component into it that needs to be tracked, and we need to be aware of it as supply chain professionals. And with that, if you add the nearshoring aspect of it, it's very important to understand your current cost as to, a specific country, could be China or anywhere in Asia, and what will be that comparison if you nearshore it either in Mexico or Canada. And also understanding all the training that you need to do in order to bring those specific items or processes into place. With that, you also need to understand what is the sustainability impact in those countries, because in some countries, if you move it, for instance, with Mexico, you need to understand if a specific state has enough water to sustain your processes or enough and stable power to sustain your processes. So, everything kind of comes into place if you kind of juggle all those spheres. But it's very important just to consider them, have them in mind. I know some companies that may be very small, it may be a little bit difficult to really put all those into play just because on the day-to-day, there may be too much to handle. But at the end of the day, if a small company services a bigger company, a big company will ask you, what are your sustainability initiatives? Because that's part of the scope 3 for them. So I believe you should have all of these in mind, regardless. I don't think they're going to go anywhere. and it's going to be on top of mind in any supply chain professional.
Well, spot on. Something that I extracted out of your answer is from a digitalization or technology aspect. You mentioned database, which I'm going to extract the word data, right? Which enables you to make those strategic decisions that are in line with your value chain. But also in sustainability, you mentioned CO2, right? You need to be able to track CO2, and I'm assuming the way you track is data as well. How important is this data for you today? And I'm assuming obviously you create your own data with the way you operate, but at the same time, there's outside in data that you receive from your customers, and in some cases from your suppliers. Depends on where you are, vertically integrated or not. So any thoughts on data and the importance for a small company versus a big company, or for both, if you want to share a little more about it?
Yeah, well, my experience has been very different. From a big company, when you have a lot of inorganic growth, you need to merge those data sets in order to make sense for a product trend that you will be having new in your supply chain. That integrity needs to be critical in order for you to really provide the last product retail wise into a specific chain or a specific supply chain node. For a smaller company, you don't deal with all the data complexity because you can really deal probably better with change management as to really utilizing the system as it should be, or really having a better data, I will say cleaner data, let's put it that way, because you can handle it more efficiently. You don't have that many data points, and hence your team will be able to really understand it and take decisions from it better than a bigger company. A bigger company, the struggle is which KPIs you will be handling. It's also on the small company, but it's like you have so many data points. It's like, what are you going to analyze? Where should I start? I think that's the biggest question, right? And right now for supply chain professionals, it's very important to understand your inventory metrics. Very, very important to understand your inventory metrics and how do they tie with your margins as a company, more so than the top line sales. Because if you understand both and how these are tied to each other, you are going to really value the supply chain in general and the data that you have and how it's going to enable you to understand and interpret some data points.
Well, that's such a good point, especially on your inventory comment, right? There's so many factors that impact your inventory of how much do I need to produce, how much do I need to go distribute, how much should I be selling, what is my demand variability. And as you start to kind of see that there's so many factors that impact how you balance your inventory to have the right level to be able to suffice your customers, but not also too much to kind of be able to have too much working capital. I think that's always a challenge where we face with a lot of customers, especially in food and beverage is key. I know with Illess, maybe the expiration dates and the shelf life might be a little longer, but in Bimbo Bakery, right, or many other customers, right, there's always a small shelf life, and being able to manage that balancing of too much and too little, it's a key component.
Yes. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Add up.
No, yeah, I think you're right on track, because if you have just a good data set, it could be even smaller. You can even reduce the number of data points. And if you have a solid sales and operations planning or an integrated business planning, using that data set by itself, your conversations will be way more relevant, right? And then, of course, that ties to any other software you want to implement, because in order to implement a software, you need to have clean data in order for it to really work, besides all the change management you need to do with your team. In order for that team to really believe in it and to really give you results, you need to have clean data. And that's something that for me, whenever I'm, having conversations with software companies, the first thing I ask, how important is for you to have the data clean? And everyone is like, it's extremely important. So that's kind of like the first thing you must do in order to continue a transformation or an SNOP or anything in any way. You need to have your data clean in order to continue that specific, journey of transformation, supply chain, you name it.
Absolutely. And I think just giving an example here to the audience, right? Data clean. One of the things that we mean is if a system is reporting that I have X 100 units on hand or 100 cases on hand of a particular product, well, we need to make sure that that matches the physical world as well. If your system is selling 50, but you have 100 on hand, then obviously all the decisions you make through data, through software, through intelligence today, it's not going to be well taken. Same with what is happening in the world, right? You start seeing more integrated supply chains, not only inside out, but more outside in, where you have the big retailers sharing data that's extremely accurate, sharing KPIs, sharing forecasts that companies could consume and then make decisions upon it. But if the data is not clean, then the decision Elsy is going to make is not going to be the right one. So I think that's such a good point. This takes me to we move away from data and technology within the role of VP of supply chain, and we go more into the people dynamics. Tell me more about maybe internal dynamics. What are some of the challenges that you usually have seen, again, from best practices when dealing with the sales team or when dealing with an R&D team or manufacturing team? So usually manufacturing team is part of the supply chain, but it depends on the company. So tell us a little bit about the biggest challenges you see that usually organizations need to go solve in terms of the people dynamics with the role of VP of supply chain, trying to deal with the different type of roles that exist within the company, like sales.
Yes, I think it all matters on the perspective people have of supply chain inside the organization and really being able to change that perspective.
For example, if I do maybe.
Yes. I think there's the examples I can give, they're very relevant because the roles that I have had in the past, not only this one, have been newly created roles in supply chain. And whenever I interview, even for the role or I move on to another role, for me, it's very important to understand which perspective is currently of supply chain inside the organization. Is it going to be a problem solver? Is it going to be a enabler of their own, teams? Is it going to help them? How do they see supply chain in their own eyes? At Bimbo, it was critical. It was absolutely critical, and it was tied to sales all the time. So supply chain was always enabling the information that was going from production to the distribution center to the customer experience. So what perspective do we need to change there? Is basically the perspective of having the latest and greatest information there was all the time. In holidays, in acts of God, hurricanes, whatever, we always needed to be top of mind as to the information that we had in order to really not only react, but really proactively provide a service internally. So that was very important. And whenever we will culprit of something, I needed to act and change the perspective as to where that rumor originated and correct it as soon as possible. With this new role, what I really liked is that everyone of the executive committee really understood that supply chain was going to help the entire organization. And that for me was very refreshing because I could see the potential as to the impact that this position was going to have. And not only that, but also to the teams that were going to be reporting to me. So having said that, that was extremely important for me to understand the perspective and then elevate it to something else. For instance, the procurement department, I changed it to procurement because it was only purchasing, but they were doing procurement as well. So it's really understanding, okay, why are we called procurement? We are negotiating. We're always, striving for lower MOQs, lead times. We are doing more than just placing an order, and really elevating that team position. Project management is always also changing a perspective. With project management, it was merely focused on new product development, but now it's being evolved to any kind of project that will transform the organization or that is even tied to a continuous improvement initiative. So really also changing the perspective that project management is not only new product development, it's going to be encompassing any kind of transformational project inside the organization. So it's a big ordeal. And as a supply chain professional, you have the network because you are the glue of the organization, and understanding those knots of people who have information and really changing the perspective, regardless of where position, with which perspective you need to change, is critical for you to really be on top of mind as to how supply chain is seen in your organization and how it needs to change in order for you to enable growth and to partner with other teams.
I appreciate those examples, Elsy, and I think they're really helpful, at least to me. One word that comes into those dynamics that you kind of explain and also illustrate with examples is collaboration, right? How you really enable collaboration, if it's through information sharing, if it's from perspective management, like, wow, this is the perspective I have from a supply chain and the role that we have within the organization and how we're going to be collaborating with you, customer, or with you, sales. Now that I just say customer, I was thinking more intra out of your internal. But how do you also see collaboration with your customers? And how do you see also organizations within the food and beverage industry collaborating with customers?
Yes, I will tell you now with this new role, I have been seeing something that I will say not necessarily odd, but some suppliers could be customers or customers could be suppliers. I don't know if it's due to the spice industry that we're in, that is pretty peculiar. But one of the things as to the dynamics with customers is that you always need to ask them, what is your strategy for growth and how you fit into that conversation? Why am I saying that? Because then that's how you find opportunities of them being suppliers or a supplier, even having the conversation with suppliers, right? What is your strategy for growth? And then even being able to sell something to them and convert them as customers or both. I think that conversation is critical. Understand your customers or suppliers' growth enablers or strategy and how it ties to your company. Because I bet there's a lot of gaps there that your company will be a perfect fit that you have no idea. And that's where supply chain professionals will really excel. And this is where is the supplier-customer partnership that I think is critical that we also must be involved with.
I think you're spot on. And I think one of the things that we try to always hear, if I put my hat at Bob's, is, you always need to go strive to see supply chain, not only from your core competencies and your own value chain from the company, but also what is happening outside, your suppliers and your customers. And then if you're able to see entire supply chains like industries or cohorts that are working together to ensure that you're having the right inventory at the right time at the right place to have the best kind of consumer satisfaction, I think everybody wins. Understanding the impacts that having the right collaboration with your suppliers or the right collaboration with your customers that people and consumers will have, the consumers of the spices, the consumers of the breads, or any other food and beverage product, I think it's definitely an important avenue for us. This has been extremely helpful, Elsy, and I think understanding the relevance of the BPF supply chain, I think we could go deep into many other topics. Any final comments you would like to share with the audience about the importance of VP of supply chain, especially kind of with your perspectives to the food and beverage industry?
Yeah, I think if your company doesn't have a supply chain role, it's very critical to really understand why or how it could be created. It will really enable the growth of your company. How to cover those conversations? You need to talk to leadership as to what's the importance of the role and how it's going to enable anything inside the company. If you already have a supply chain role but it's not elevating enough, then you need to understand why and what's the true value proposition of the supply chain, what it really covers, what does it really mean for your company, and try to elevate that. Put your name on the hat to really grow the position. I think there's a lot of possibilities there that we could do in order to really make the supply chain position grow.
But I think those are the words of wisdom. I would like to finish kind of the webinar. Elsy, thank you so much. We much appreciate your perspectives. This has been extremely helpful. And thank you also Conversations in Retail, Matt, for kind of hosting us as well. And we greatly appreciate it. You guys have a nice Thanksgiving break. Thank you.
Jorge, bye-bye.
Take care. It's a pleasure.